The streets of Dublin were unusually quiet, but beneath that silence, something dangerous was breathing. While British soldiers were dying in the mud of France, a different kind of war was being prepared in the shadows of Ireland. Rifles were being hidden, messages were whispered in back rooms, and a question was burning in every rebel's mind. If Britain is fighting for freedom in Europe, why is Ireland still in chains? For centuries, Ireland had lived under British control, and by the early 20th century, frustration had reached a breaking point. Many Irish people had hoped that political struggle would bring them self-rule, but each promise from London seemed to end in delay or disappointment. When World War I erupted in 1914, Britain dragged Ireland into the conflict as part of the United Kingdom, expecting loyalty and manpower. Thousands of Irishmen were sent to fight in British uniforms, dying for an empire that denied them independence. To many in Ireland, this felt like the ultimate insult, a demand for sacrifice without dignity. At the same time, Irish revolutionary groups were quietly organizing. The Irish Volunteers, the Irish Republican Brotherhood, and other nationalist circles believed that Britain's weakness during the war was an opportunity sent by fate. They watched as Britain poured its soldiers, weapons, and money into the European front, leaving fewer forces at home. To the rebels, this was not just a war between nations, it was a crack in the empire's armor. If Ireland was ever to rise, it had to be now, while Britain was distracted and bleeding. British authorities were not blind to the tension, but they underestimated the depth of anger in Ireland. In London, officials assumed that wartime patriotism would silence dissent. They believed Irishmen would rally to the flag, grateful for being part of a great empire fighting against Germany. What they failed to understand was that many Irish saw Germany not as an enemy, but as a possible ally against Britain. The idea that England's difficulty is Ireland's opportunity spread like fire through nationalist circles, turning hope into determination. Behind closed doors, secret meetings took place, plans were drawn, and weapons were smuggled. Some leaders dreamed of a dramatic uprising that would shock the world and force Britain to listen. Others knew it would be a desperate gamble, likely ending in bloodshed, but they believed that even failure would awaken the Irish spirit. The coming rebellion was not just about military victory. It was about breaking psychological chains, proving that Ireland was not a submissive colony, but a nation willing to fight. As Easter 1916 approached, tension thickened in the air. British commanders were focused on the Western Front, unaware that a storm was gathering at home. Dublin, with its narrow streets and historic buildings, was about to become a battlefield. The rebels knew they were outnumbered, outgunned, and likely doomed, but they also knew something Britain did not, that a single act of defiance can change the course of history. And in the heart of the empire, a rebellion was about to explode. When the first shots were fired, confusion spread faster than fear. Ordinary citizens stepped into the streets and saw armed men taking positions in post offices, courts, and public buildings. The rebels moved quickly, occupying key locations across Dublin, raising the green flag of Ireland where the British flag once flew. To them, this was not chaos, it was the birth of a nation. But to the British authorities, it was an unexpected nightmare unfolding in the middle of a global war. The General Post Office became the heart of the rebellion, a symbol of defiance standing in the center of the city. From its steps, the proclamation of the Irish Republic was read aloud, declaring independence from British rule. For many who heard it, the words felt unreal, like a dream spoken into the air. Britain had ruled Ireland for generations, and now a small group of determined men was openly challenging the empire. The message was clear: Ireland was done waiting. British forces were slow to react at first, caught off guard by the suddenness of the uprising. Their main military focus was still on the Western Front, where every soldier was needed. But as news spread and the seriousness of the situation became clear, reinforcements were rushed into Dublin. The city that had once been calm turned into a war zone. Gunfire echoed through the streets, smoke rose from burning buildings, and civilians were trapped between two forces with no safe place to run. The rebels fought with courage but lacked heavy weapons, ammunition, and proper military training. Many of them were teachers, poets, workers, and students, not professional soldiers. Yet their determination made them dangerous. They held their positions against British troops, using the narrow streets and buildings to their advantage. Each hour they resisted was a message to the world that Ireland would not kneel quietly. Britain, embarrassed and alarmed, responded with force. Artillery was brought in, and heavy shells were fired into the heart of Dublin. Historic buildings were reduced to rubble, and entire streets were destroyed. The empire that claimed to bring order and civilization was now turning its guns on one of its own cities. For many Irish people watching their homes burn, any remaining loyalty to Britain died in the smoke. Civilians paid the highest price. Families hid in cellars, children cried in fear, and the wounded lay in the streets with no one able to reach them. Shops were looted, not out of greed but out of desperation, as food became scarce. The rebellion, which had begun as a political statement, was now a humanitarian disaster. Yet even in this suffering, sympathy for the rebels grew. People who had once been neutral began to question why such destruction was being unleashed on Dublin. Inside the rebel strongholds, morale was fading but resolve remained. Messages were passed between positions, telling fighters to hold on, to not surrender, to make every moment count. They knew the odds were against them. They knew Britain had more men, more weapons, and more resources. But they also knew that the world was watching, and that their sacrifice would not be forgotten. To them, surrender meant returning to silence, and silence was worse than death. As the days passed, the balance of power became brutally clear. British troops tightened their grip, cutting off supplies and isolating rebel positions one by one. The sound of gunfire never stopped. The dream of a quick, decisive victory faded, replaced by the reality of survival. Yet even in defeat, something powerful was happening. The rebellion was planting a seed in the hearts of the Irish people, a seed that would grow long after the guns fell silent. And as the city burned and the rebels bled, Britain faced an uncomfortable truth. While it was fighting Germany in the name of freedom, it was crushing that same freedom in Ireland. The contradiction was impossible to hide. The empire's image was cracking, and Ireland was no longer willing to be invisible. When the final order to surrender was given, it was not because the rebels had lost their courage, but because they had run out of everything else. Ammunition was nearly gone, buildings were collapsing, and civilians were paying a terrible price. One by one, the rebel positions fell silent. The men who had dared to challenge the British Empire laid down their weapons, knowing they were stepping into captivity. There was no cheering crowd, no victory parade, only exhaustion, smoke, and the heavy feeling of defeat hanging over Dublin. British soldiers moved quickly to arrest the leaders of the uprising. They were taken away under guard, some wounded, some defiant, all aware that their fate would be decided by the empire they had just challenged. Military courts were set up, trials were rushed, and sentences were harsh. Executions followed, one after another, carried out behind prison walls. To British authorities, this was justice and deterrence. To the Irish public, it was something else entirely. Each execution did not weaken the rebellion, it strengthened it. Each shot fired by the firing squad echoed in the hearts of the people. At first, many Irish citizens had been unsure about the uprising. Some had even been angry at the rebels for bringing violence into their streets. But as the executions continued, public opinion began to shift. Men who had once been seen as reckless troublemakers were now viewed as martyrs. Their faces, their words, their final letters spread across Ireland. The empire had crushed the rebellion, but in doing so, it had created heroes. And heroes are more dangerous than rebels because they live on in memory. Britain soon realized that it had miscalculated. The military victory in Dublin did not restore control, it weakened it. support for independence grew rapidly. Young men and women who had never thought of politics before now spoke of freedom with fire in their eyes. The idea of Irish self-rule was no longer a distant dream discussed in quiet rooms. It was a public demand. The Easter Rising had failed on the battlefield, but it had succeeded in awakening a nation. The timing of all this made the situation even more painful for Britain. While its soldiers were still dying in France, it now faced a growing resistance at home. The empire was being pulled in two directions. Resources were stretched, attention was divided, and confidence was shaken. The world began to see the contradiction more clearly. Britain claimed to fight for freedom and democracy, yet denied both to Ireland. That hypocrisy did not go unnoticed, neither by the Irish nor by international observers. In the years that followed, the consequences of the uprising became impossible to contain. Political movements grew stronger, armed groups reorganized, and the struggle for independence intensified. What had begun as a short, desperate rebellion turned into a long and determined fight. Britain found itself trapped in a conflict it could no longer easily control. The relationship between the two islands had been permanently changed. Trust was broken, and fear replaced obedience. And so, while World War I is remembered for trenches, gas, and distant battlefields, in Ireland it is remembered for something else. It is remembered as the moment when a small nation dared to stand up while an empire was distracted. It is remembered as the week when Dublin burned and Ireland woke up. Britain may have won the streets, but it lost the future. Because from that moment on, Ireland was no longer asking for freedom. It was preparing to take it.